Morning, everybody. We're going to call the commission to order. Secretary Burgess, are there any changes to today's agenda?
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. There are no changes to the agenda this morning.
Thank you. So just for everyone's notice, we're going to take matters slightly out of order. The first step of matters we're going to deal with are related to item 301A. But before we begin, and I know, Raj, you're going to be providing us an overview of a number of the energy matters we're going to be dealing with today that are related to the changes we're making in the industry. I want to just sort of open this up and frame it up a little bit. I'm really very excited about what we're going to be starting to address today. And I was thinking about it was just about a year ago this time that we actually, in the context of the EAPS order, started the discussion of saying, you know, technology's changed, the market's changed, and it's really time for us to start thinking about how we use alternative technology, distributed energy resources, load response, as something that's no longer on the periphery, that's no longer supported by individual government programs, but is actually integrated into the tapestry of how we develop and manage the grid. And since that time, many of you, good morning, Mr. Stegemiller. I just came back to visit with us from vacation. It's good to see you. Since that time, you know, we've opened the Rev docket, hence Rudy, who's done such an incredible amount of work, as well as everybody else on that. And we've taken a number of different steps to really start thinking about that. Really, the role of good government is to understand where technology is going, where innovation is occurring, where the needs of customers are changing, and to make sure that our job as economic regulators are that we are doing what we can do to make sure that we're meeting our fundamental obligations of ensuring electricity is delivered in a way that's reliable, that's secure, that it's cost effective, and taking advantage of change and technology change to accomplish that. And so that regulation really needs to both lead and allow, as opposed to lag and then create market disruption. So that really what this is all about. But even if we didn't think about REV, I think the matters that are before us today and what we're going to be talking about are things that we really need to be doing. And they're things we need to do because of the fact that we have such opportunities in this industry. There's so much excitement around how do we use distributed energy resources better. There's such excitement about how do we use social networking better. And how do we get the electric industry really into the 21st century and thinking about how we use communication devices better. So really a lot of what we're talking about today is really the step forward that I believe very strongly we have to make, because, you know, while a lot of folks would like us to say, well, study it more, it's been studied. It's been studied throughout the United States. We've had endless demonstration projects across the United States that have shown how better demand response, have shown how solar energy, have shown how distributed energy, have shown how smart communications can make things better. So I think what's important as we move forward and we make these and take some of the steps that we're beginning to take today is that we move from the academic and the study to the experience so that we can all look back and learn from that. So I'm very excited. I'm very proud of the fact that the staff has been thoughtful in the approaches, thinking forward in terms of what things should we be doing now to both set the stage for the future and to create the necessary learnings. And also very I guess, you know, I take a lot of pride in the amount of industry engagement we've had and consumer engagement. I think that, you know, as a whole, when I talk to folks, people are very excited in the state about the opportunities we have. And I think the issues before us today are issues that we should be contemplating, and how do we make the concept into experience that we can all learn so that we can start providing benefits to consumers. So with that, I'm interested in the discussion. These are obviously complex matters, and I know that the staff has done quite a bit of work in moving this forward. And I think it should be a very interesting day, and we're all going to learn a lot. So with that, let me turn it over to Raj to introduce the topics at hand.
Good morning, Chair Zibelman and Commissioners. After your introduction, my introduction is going to sound very feeble. we are very pleased
Never,
to
Raj, never.
bring forward 5 related yet distinct items for your consideration this morning. All these items are in pursuit of advancing the Commission's policy interest in improved utility system efficiency, facilitation of competitive new market entrants and market animation, improved reliability and resiliency, increased customer engagement, empowerment and affordability of energy, and lowering emissions. As you said, while the generic Reforming the Energy Vision docket is examining various potential modifications to the current paradigm in the utility structure behind the meter to accomplish these objectives, the initiatives before you today need not wait. Customers, utilities, and other stakeholders are demanding action, and they're demanding action now. Hence, the issues before you today need immediate attention. Given the known and anticipated benefits of these initiatives, we believe we should move forward with these now and not wait for a full Track 1 or Track 2 decision of the Rev docket. The first 2 items that will be presented deal with improved integration of non-wires technologies and new business models into the utility system as we move forward to fundamentally transform the energy industry to accomplish the Commission policy objectives. Marco Padula will first begin with offering recommendations on the Con Edison's petition for action on its Brownsville initiative that the company is carrying out from its last rate case decision. For the first time, an initiative is being undertaken in the state to seriously consider comprehensively, in an open and competitive manner, non-wires alternatives to traditional utility delivery infrastructure investments. This is a departure from the status quo. It's a departure from the traditional way of doing business. This is an exciting project that the whole industry is watching as to how other technologies will be deployed in a more cost-effective and cleaner fashion to meet customer needs, how customers will be engaged, how markets will be animated, and more importantly, how regulators will modify regulatory structures to motivate utilities and other stakeholders to think differently and more innovatively in offering solutions to meet customer needs. Then Tammy Mitchell will discuss the status of existing and planned REV-type demonstration projects and offer guidelines and criteria for future development of such projects. Several stakeholders, including utilities and third parties, have been asking for guidance as they develop their demonstration projects. There are significant opportunities for innovative demonstration projects that can offer valuable lessons as we embark on transforming the industry, and the Commission should provide guidance now to help them shape their projects. The results from these demonstration projects can go a long way in informing future path in the industry transformation. The next 2 items deal with continuing and expanding existing successful programs. The Commission opened a generic docket in 2009 on utility programs for demand response, but initially focused efforts on Zone J, or New York City, where there is the best bang for the buck. Since then, the Con Edison demand response programs have been continually refined to incorporate lessons learned. Several hundred megawatts are participating in various Con Ed demand response programs now. Given the rich history of these programs in the city and knowing their benefits, it's time to expand this effort statewide so we can capture the low-hanging fruit quickly and implement them by next summer. In this iteration, we should strive to move to the next generation of dynamic load management programs to help accomplish many of the Commission objectives. Steve Keller will discuss staff recommendations on this item. Fourth, with the rapid implementation and penetration of qualified renewable resources, caps for net metering are being approached in some of the utilities. Several entities have asked the Commission to take action to address the cap issue and certain other net metering issues. Tina Palmero and Len Van Ryn will provide staff recommendations on proposed modifications to current net metering programs. Finally, Luann Scherer will discuss an innovative community choice aggregation concept that will significantly increase opportunities for customer engagement and participation in energy programs, and offer recommendations on moving forward with exploring this concept. To recap, Collectively, all these 5 items are geared to promoting utility system efficiency, improved reliability and resiliency, animation of markets, and facilitating entry of new innovative players to provide better products and services to customers in a competitive manner, to engage customers and enable them to manage their bills better and to help reduce emissions. These are major initiatives that we believe will help move the ball forward in the beginning stages of transforming the industry. We need to act, and we need to act now to meet the needs of customers better. And up front, I want to acknowledge that an immense amount of staff work, as you acknowledged, Chair, has gone into preparing these items by not only those presenting the items here today, but all those supporting from behind. Thank you. And we'll start with Marco's first item.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, Marco. Please begin.
Good morning, Chair Ziebelman and Commissioners. Item 304A and 304B are companion items related to the Con Edison Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program, which I will refer to as the BQDM program. Item 304A is a draft resolution which would have the Commission assume lead agency status under the State Environmental Quality Review Act, and based on its review of the environmental assessment form and the record in case 14E0302, adopt a negative declaration of environmental significance regarding its action on Con Edison's proposed BQDM program. The draft resolution would have the Commission find that the proposed action will not have a significant adverse effect on the environment. Staff recommends that the Commission adopt the draft resolution and issue a notice of determination of non-significance. Item 304B is a draft order that would establish the Con Edison BQDM program. The BQDM program would allow Con Edison to procure market-based distributed energy resource solutions, such as energy efficiency, energy storage, distributed generation, demand response, to achieve load reductions on the sub-transmission feeders supplying the Brownsville number 1 and number 2 substations. This program builds upon the company's existing targeted DSM program, which has been operational since 2004, but significantly expands the number of market participants and potential technology solutions. These market-based solutions, in combination with other traditional T&D investments, will allow the company to defer major substation need date from 2017 to 2026 while achieving an overall lower cost to ratepayers. There are 5 key decision areas that I will now discuss. Those are the benefit cost analysis, program cost and recovery, earnings opportunities, DER ownership, and the RFI and RFP review and selection process. On the issue of the benefit cost analysis, the draft order would have the Commission adopt the benefit cost analysis framework provided by the company and require filing of the results after the selection of a portfolio resulting in a positive net benefit is completed and the actual costs are known. In addition, the draft order requires the benefit cost analysis to include a description of any non-monetized benefits of the program. On the issue of program costs and recovery, the draft order caps total spending on the BQDM program at $200 million. This includes $25 million of existing targeted DSM program funding. The $175 million BQDM program costs would be amortized and recovered over a 10-year period and would include the Commission-approved rate of return. Cost recovery would be through the monthly adjustment clause for full-service customers and through a monthly surcharge for NYPA customers until the next rate case filing at which time recovery would be moved into base rates. On the issue of earnings opportunities, the draft order would establish new earnings opportunities for the company which are tied to REV policy objectives. Those policy objectives are DER market animation and lowering overall cost to ratepayers. The earnings opportunities would total 100 basis points on top of the allowed ROE related to the BQDM program costs. This is approximately $5 million and would be spread over 3 metrics. 45 basis points would be tied to achieving and exceeding the customer-cited goal of 41 megawatts. 25 basis points would be tied to increasing the diversity of DER suppliers in the marketplace. And 30 basis points would be tied to reducing the dollar per megawatt life cycle cost of the complete Brownsville feeder overload solution. On the issue of DER ownership, the draft order evaluates the Commission's vertical market power policy statement in light of the substantial changes to the electric market contemplated by REV. By adopting the order, the Commission would be permitting Con Edison to own grid-based storage solutions for the following reasons. Customer-cited battery storage is not precluded, and ownership by the company is only authorized as appropriate where installation is on the distribution system. There is value in gaining experience with storage-based solutions, and grid-based storage will enable the deployment of other third-party DER technologies. For DER resources other than grid-based storage, the draft order would permit Con Edison to own them only as a backstop where the market fails to respond and 5 specific conditions are met. Those conditions are: a market solicitation was performed and determined to be ineffective. The DER must be located on Con Edison-owned property. The DER assets must address a substantial system need. The benefits of ownership must outweigh the cost of such ownership. And a competitive solicitation for construction and operation is required. On the issue of RFI and RFP review and selection, to ensure fair and equitable treatment of all RFI and RFP respondents, the draft order will require an independent third party to be hired to review the selection process with direct reporting to staff. This review will cover the RFI issued in July for customer-cited and company-cited non-traditional solutions, the RFP issued in October for company-cited storage, as well as any future RFI or RFP under the BQDM program. This concludes my presentation, and I'm available for comments or questions.
Great. Thank you, Marco. And I think from the perspective of many, when you take a look at this project, and we've talked about trying to drive innovation in this industry, clearly what we're doing in the BQDM, although it's a hard acronym to remember,
Difficult.
is sort of hits it on all corners. I mean, the first thing is it's pretty obvious that the easiest thing for Con Ed to have done is to say we have growing demand in the region. There is no question about that. And in fact, it's something we like. It's the fact that we have economic growth and that is driving electric demand. That's a good thing. And so coming in and saying we need to build a substation to meet that demand and putting that into a rate case that would have been amongst many other things would have been very easy for Con Ed to put forth and really easy for this commission to actually approve. So that the fact that we are taking a step back and saying, well, that's what the traditional route is. Let's see what we can do differently around distributed energy resources and load management. and take a bit of risk to see if actually these resources will appear in the marketplace and meet that need, but do it in a very careful manner, because as we've know that this has to happen, and it has to happen with all due speed, because if it doesn't materialize, we will need to meet the demand, so we have to move forward. Is I think exactly the type of action and reaction that we would like to see move in this industry. And I applaud Con Ed, the stakeholders. I know this was an issue that came up in the last rate case, but actually taking this step forward to move forward is a great thing. The second is, in picking a project, we probably picked one of the most complex issues, is that they're doing it in the middle of an urban area. You know, many people, when they look at these things, they could do it in a commercial building where you have a lot of industrial load, and it's a pretty easy. You've got one customer, two customers, that's all you have to deal with. Actually going in and saying we're going to deal with a myriad of customers, different types of customers, residential customers, and start working on these so that the collective whole can actually work together to create a benefit not only for themselves but all of Con Ed's system is really a terrific undertaking, and I think is frankly a lot of what people talk about when they talk about smart cities and smart communities. So doing this is also, I think, is a great thing. But in saying that, I want to make sure it's clear that I don't think we're doing a lot of experimentation, because, again, as I said in my opening comments, a lot of these resources have been deployed. There's been a lot of demonstrations showing that this works. It's just that we're trying to deploy it here, and we're showing how it can work in New York City. The other thing is that I think is great about this project is the way we're going about it in terms of using requests for interest and requests for quotes. A lot of times, and historically, utilities would identify a problem, and then they would design the solution, and then they would go out and they'd get the solution that they designed. What we're doing here very differently is saying we've got a problem. We need to meet this level of 41 megawatts of demand. We're trying to do it in a way that's different. And we're going to ask for requests of interest and develop proposals for the market to come back and all the innovation in that market to come back and identify solutions that we, either in the staff level or the company, would not necessarily have thought about on their own. So I think this is a great opportunity to show how you can, in setting a demand, you can get a market response. And but in doing so, I think it is very important that, as we've talked about in Rev, and what is the staff is suggesting here, is that we have the independence of staff with an overseer, so that there's confidence that there's a third party looking at this, and that the staff is also engaged in looking at that. That's also particularly important because we are looking, one of the things that has been identified as an opportunity here is looking at storage. Marco, I think you've talked about the desire in this particular proceeding to look at grid-based storage on Con Ed's system. One of the things that has been, become very, very apparent in this industry is the importance that storage is going to play in enabling distributed energy resources, renewable energy, etc. And it makes the system more dynamic, it makes it more flexible, it makes it more secure. But it's also true that I think that the utility industry itself doesn't have the level of experience with storage that I think they're going to need moving forward. So for that reason, I am very comfortable, and I think it's important that our utilities get this experience, because until they get the experience on how storage can operate on the system, we're never really going to understand the full capability of using storage as a way of helping manage the grid going forward. We had an opportunity to listen a little bit what has happened in California since the state there developed a program around storage, and the utilities have reported out that they've seen huge advantages in terms of integrating solar, in making the grid more flexible, in dealing with perturbances on the system. And so they have seen opportunities that they didn't envision, and I think it's going to be very important for the state utilities in New York to also get that. I know in this case we are just addressing the Brooklyn Queens, but I think for the purposes of this project, particularly because of the complexity of this project, I am also comfortable with the idea of having ability to use storage on the Con Ed system. And then the other piece that I think is very important here is how we're setting up the economic advantages, because they are very much tied to the types of things we'd like to see. I mean, I think that what staff is proposing makes a lot of sense. This isn't just about getting 100 basis points and doing something differently. It is around the types of outcomes of driving innovation, driving savings, and demonstrating, in fact, that you are doing something in terms of engaging customers to help drive solutions that we want to see going forward. So for all of those reasons, I believe that this project is one that the state should feel very proud of. I certainly am appreciative of the work that staff has done, and I'm prepared to vote that it moves forward. So any other further comments? Commissioner Brown?
I think the toughest part of this case has been the balance between trying to figure out the role that the local utility should have, at the same time really trying to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation by others. I know in some of the comments people wanted us to go completely one way or perhaps completely the other, which I think both approaches would have been incorrect. This is not a pilot program, I agree with you. This is a real program. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from it. So I think we've hit a very good balance, but it's something I think we should keep our eyes closely on. We want the utilities to be playing. We want them to play their important role. At the same time, we want to see if there can be new, fresh ideas that emerge that come from others besides the utility, and that we maintain that balance. So that'll be one of the things I'm watching for as we go through this process. But I think it's a very, very good starting point.
Thank you. Commissioner Porter? Yes? No? No? Commissioner?
I have some general comments that apply to this and the other 4 items in the what I call the Rev basket this morning, in support of all 5. I am a strong supporter of the Rev policy goals, as explained by Chair Zibelman. Given the magnitude of the changes we're contemplating, my view is that we need to be, as we move forward, careful, incremental, and collaborative. We're not going to change the landscape in one fell swoop in our Track 1 order or our Track 2 order, and that requires us to take small steps, partly because the changes that we're contemplating are so large overall, and partly because we know we're not going to make precisely the right decisions every time something comes in front of us. I think these items satisfy all of these considerations. We're being careful, we're moving incrementally, we're working collaboratively with the stakeholders, and we're developing track records that will give us a history and metrics as to whether what we're doing to implement these policies are right or possibly what needs more work. So I'm pleased to see these items. I'm pleased to start moving ahead, even ahead of Track 1.
Thank you. First, I'm very supportive of this item and will be voting yes. I do come back to the goals of REV and very much support them. And the PSC began a process to transform our regulation of the electric distribution utilities, and we articulated core policy outcomes intended to better align the role and operations of utilities to enable market and customer-driven change. And I think this item clearly does demonstrate that those outcomes that we have identified as our policies are really being utilized. And for me, when I look at the 5 core policy outcomes, I think what strikes me is that two of them are most prominent in this, which is increasing system-wide efficiency by encouraging innovation, and also we are assuring a secure, reliable, and resilient electric system will exist and continue to grow. And I'm very happy that people and commenters were at the table in terms of submitting their concerns and their comments, because it helped us to develop a better work product and to look at where we are going. And this program, I think, will really be something that we will monitor very closely in terms of looking at what are the successes from this. And really the overwhelming piece of it that I was very pleased with was the focus on working with the utilities and others and looking at animating the market and the ensuring that we do have a competitive process through the RFI and the RFP, so that it really ensures fairness to all. So I am very happy with that. I do want to just ask Marco to clarify and sort of bring home the point of the need to do this item today, and why, if we waited, that it would not be helpful to New York.
I think the most pressing reason is that the company is currently in an overload situation on those feeders. For this past summer and for the next summer, they're taking measures to satisfy that. But once you get into 2016 and 2017, there's a definite need to satisfy the forecasted load. So we really need to move as soon as possible.
Thank you. And I think that also is a very important matter, and the reliability of our system is critical, and this is something we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I knew you would.
You knew I couldn't control myself. I agree with everything that's been said today, and as we all know, everyone is looking at New York and where we're going with REV. And so I think today this really launches something that's very exciting, and will have people actually see something concrete that they can get an idea of where we're going. So I think, it's good that we picked a complicated project and not just a simple one, because we know if we can get this done in New York City, the rest of the state won't be that difficult to follow. So I really appreciate all the work that's been done on this, and concur with the chair and my colleagues that the effort that's been put forward on this is immense, and it really is appreciated by all the commissioners as to what you've done. Again, to move the REV forward and to get New York highlighted as to where we're going. So good job.
Thank you. I think to echo the questions in terms of why now, I think it's very important. I think, and the way that I understand this project is designed is really to make certain that we have the cushions that we need. So we are going to be going out looking to get things done quickly. That will give us some amount of load reductions and move it forward. There is, obviously, in a lot of the things that we're doing and comments, we've received some healthy skepticism. We kind of like to joke. Everyone says, I like REV, and then there's a line of buts. And the buts of all the things that people are a little bit concerned about. But in this instance, I think one of the things that I would say is this healthy skepticism is a good thing. We are looking at it. We're taking these measured steps so we can get the experience. And as my fellow commissioners have said, that allows us then to adjust our regulatory and our format and our market approaches to make sure we have continued success. So I, again, applaud the company for stepping up and identifying what I think is a very innovative solution to a traditional problem. And for the staff for the hard work that they've done, as well as the other stakeholders for their thoughtful comments on how we can best proceed and make this a success for everyone. So with that, I'm going to move to a vote then on both items 304A and 304B. 304A is the SECRA declaration. So all those in favor of the recommendation to adopt a resolution and issue a negative declaration in accordance with the State Environmental Quality Review Act, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing no opposition, there being none, the recommendation is adopted. The next item then is item 304B. And all those in favor of the recommendation to approve Con Edison's Brooklyn Queens Demand Response Program as described in this proceeding, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing no opposition, there being none, the recommendation is adopted. Thank you very much, and thank you, Marco. The next item then on our agenda is in connection with the REV proceeding, and it concerns the use and development of demonstration projects. And Tammy Mitchell, who is the chief of our electric distribution system, is going to be presenting that today. So Tammy, please go ahead.
Good morning, Chair Zibelman and Commissioners. Item 305 recommends that the Commission adopt a resolution encouraging the utilities and third parties to begin developing potential demonstration projects to help inform the Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV, initiative. Staff's August 22nd straw proposal on REV Track 1 issues noted the importance of demonstration projects to inform the REV initiative. The straw proposal went on to discuss some general criteria which could be used for the development of such projects. As you are aware, the Commission has not yet acted on the August 22nd staff proposal on Track 1 issues of the REV proceeding. However, when the Commission does act, it would be preferable to have demonstration projects that are ready to be rolled out. Additionally, as you are aware, some utilities have proposed or are currently pursuing REV-like demonstration projects, either within rate case filings or through programs such as NYSERDA Program Opportunity Notices, Department of Energy grants, and such. I'll just mention a few, as you pointed out. We have seen REV-like demonstration projects. For instance, there are proposals by Central Hudson and Orange and Rockland in their recent rate case filings to demonstrate advanced communication systems, advanced automation, and metering. In addition, of course, we heard about Con Edison's BQDM, which is a demonstration type project. We also have National Grid, who has a partnership with EPRI, the University of Buffalo, and Buffalo Niagara campus to study the feasibility of a microgrid system in the city of Buffalo, a project that was awarded funding by NYSERDA. So these are just a few examples. There are others. Also underway is the Governor's New York Prize Initiative. That's a contest that will provide funding toward the development of microgrids. These efforts could be informed by demonstration project criteria that could be adopted when the Commission decides the Track 1 issues. Therefore, this resolution would outline some of the criteria that the Commission is currently considering as guidance for utilities and third parties as they begin working to develop potential demonstration projects. The goals of any REV demonstration project should include measuring customer response to various programs, pricing, products, services, and technologies. The project should inform the REV proceeding, including providing information related to the Distributed System Platform, or DSP. The demonstration project should explore different business models and should test different technologies. The following are suggested REV demonstration criteria for Commission consideration. First, and importantly, REV demonstration should include partnerships between utilities and third-party service providers. And also, utilities should endeavor to support demonstration where third parties use their own capital. In designing the demonstration projects, the utility should identify problems or situations on the grid and allow the market to respond with solutions, as opposed to the traditional RFP, RFI method where the utility has a pre-diagnosed solution. To this end, data sharing will be essential to enable market participants to propose solutions. Demonstration should delineate how the generated economic value will be divided between the customer, utility, and third-party service providers, and should propose how much of the projected capital expense needs to go into rate base versus competitive markets. Demonstrations should be designed to help create subsequently competitive markets. Therefore, proponents of demonstration projects should strive for third-party ownership. I'll just note here that there will be a change to the item before you to reflect this previous statement. On page 9, under Market Solutions, the line beginning "also third-party ownership of DER" will be replaced with the sentence, "also proponents of demonstration projects should strive for the third-party ownership of distributed energy resources, keeping in mind that any regime of third-party ownership must be done in a manner that ensures safety, reliability, and consumer protection." And we'll get that changed to you. Demonstration should inform potential pricing and rate design modifications by testing, for example, customer response to demand response programs, or real-time or time-of-use pricing. Demonstration should also test how technologies can be used to benefit customers, encourage customer participation, and allow customers to manage their electric bills. Utility and third-party service providers should consider deploying, in their own demonstrations, advanced distribution systems, including two-way communications, real-time operation of dynamic load, and other system technologies that support awareness, flexibility, efficiency, and cost-effectiveness. Utilities should explore opportunities in their demonstrations to work with and include various residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial customer participants. In conclusion, this item recommends that, in addition to adopting the resolution encouraging utilities and third parties to begin preparing REV demonstration projects, the Secretary should also issue a notice communicating the Commission's encouragement of demonstration projects and criteria the Commission is considering. This concludes my presentation, and I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Tammy. So, since we've begun the REV process, we've had many visitors actually to come to us and have a number of staff who are actually looking at the various technologies, looking at the opportunities. And the utilities themselves have also identified a lot of opportunities that they would like to explore. I think that what's clear to me as we move forward is that the pace of change, as well as the way the markets work, are much faster than we do things habitually in regulatory world that we live in. And also there's always a concern that if we're not able to receive new ideas to do what we do better, these folks will go elsewhere. And because the fact is that, while regulators can be patient and you can have patient capital in a regulated utility, there's not patient capital elsewhere in the world, and we need to attract these markets, these invaders in, and give them a vehicle so that they can develop projects and move on at a pace that we can get some successes. Not to suggest that we should be driven by the markets alone, but the fact of the matter is that we need to understand that as we're going to bring third parties in and that we're going to ask them to put some capital at risk, we have to find a way to make sure that we can accommodate that through our processes. And I think that identifying this as a matter to move forward on is an important issue. The other point, I think, is in terms of how we're providing these guidelines. It is very apparent, I think, to everyone here, we're going to be taking up these issues in the REV proceeding and looking at all of these concerns in terms of how do we integrate third-party players, how do we move forward in terms of recognizing these things in rates, how do we provide the right incentives. So these issues today really should be seen as they're portrayed as guidelines on demonstrations. One of the things that we know is that several years ago, the federal government started with the ARRA, and they did a series of pilots, and those pilots really did show some advantages of technology, but they didn't move. They were pilots, and nothing got integrated into the industry, or very little things got integrated into the industry. What I think the demonstrations, and I think it's an important distinction, is not really necessarily demonstrating technology, because again, I think the technologies are there. It's really demonstrating the business models. How do we move from a full monopoly and integrate it into allowing for these distributed resources and to be integrated into how we manage the system, and what kind of parties will come to the table, and what kind of business models we should develop, and what kind of pricing schemes make sense. And again, I know for Commissioner Akinpora, always mindful of the fact that we as a commission need to be flexible and be willing to change. It's clear that while we can sit here at 3 Empire Plaza and write the best white papers and really be thoughtful, until we get some demonstrations out there and we get parties into these markets, we'll only be as good as we can think it through versus getting the real experience and seeing how things work and hearing from the third parties, a larger ecosystem of people who want to be part of this industry, including the customers themselves. So I think, providing these guidelines, moving this forward, getting some innovative juices flowing and having third parties come in is important. One of the things that I think will be very helpful is something that Commissioner Berman actually mentioned to me yesterday, which is, how do people know where to go? And when they go into a company, who do they call and say, I have this idea, I'd like to work with you? So one of the things I'd like to follow up on is that we ought to have a vehicle of moving forward so that the companies can at least let us know if people come to us and say, we're interested in talking to so-and-so, who should I call, that we have a name and a number. It sounds pretty simple, but it's sometimes hard for people to navigate these large companies and figure out who to call and who to speak to. So I think that would be a good idea. Again, I see these as an opportunity to provide guidelines, provide an opportunity for people to come forward with these projects. As Tammy, as you mentioned, there are a number already, but I think there are even more that are sort of waiting. I also want to make it very clear that our purposes today are talking about demonstrations that involve utilities. It does not prevent anybody from signing up customers. We are an open market state, so any third party who wants to provide an investment and work with customers, and you don't need to come to us. Go at it. We're very happy to see you come into this market. So this isn't just one way to get into this door. So with that, I'm very supportive of the resolution. I think providing guidelines, I would expect that as we move forward in the Rev docket appropriately, we will be looking at making certain that there's mechanisms for cost recovery, that there are mechanisms for approval that allow us to provide the guidance and to allow for an approval process that gives everyone confidence that they could move forward in a time frame that makes sense for business. But for now, what I think is important is that we continue to work on these demonstrations and get them announced and get them going. So I'm supportive of the resolution. You wanna?
Well, thank you very much. I think that this is your presentation was very helpful, and Chair Zibelman's comments were also very helpful. For me, I'm going to be abstaining on this order because I do, when I look at it, think that we don't necessarily need to, at this time, issue an order that has guidelines. I think that from my perspective, the first item that we looked at was one that was able to be done without us being dictatorial, and I'm not saying that we are here, in laying out different guidelines. I know that the process procedurally still is working through in terms of the SAPA process on other items. And so for me, when I look at this, I would rather tackle now either more directly some of the specific issues in REV that might then be appropriate, rather than layering on more guidance to what should be done. And I'd rather open it really for folks. I'm very supportive of demonstration projects. I think that people are already in the midst of them, and I don't want to tie anyone's hands or misread too much into a particular guidance point as this is what you must do. I'd rather let it happen more holistically in people coming to us with their best ideas after collaboration, and then having folks comment on that, and then from that perspective coming up with the best order for each particular demonstration project. And I think what's helpful also is Chair Zibelman talked about other pilots that did not get fully integrated into the system. And I think that that is our job also, is to make sure that what we are doing in demonstration projects, what's brought forward and we bless, that we then look to those projects and see what is helpful to then fully integrate after we've had experience with that. So I am in support of the demonstration projects. I understand the rationale behind the guidance, but I'm going to be abstaining because I think that I'd rather see it come more from the folks that are putting it together. So thank you.
Thank you. Further comments?
I support this item. I see the demonstration projects as providing us a vehicle to really kind of test a variety of things. One thing I've learned over the years, you mentioned all our visitors. Many of our visitors tell us, you should tell the consumers what they want and force it down their throat regulatorily. What drives change is when people say, how come I can't do that? And if there's a demonstration program in Syracuse, how come my cousin in Syracuse can use this app that allows them to control their home automation system that I can't use? And we need projects out there in order to ensure what does work and what doesn't work. And what I find the guidelines not as stifling, but as just answering some basic questions, that if we don't answer the basic questions, we'll spend the next year arguing over whether utility should be involved here or a third party should be involved there. And I thought it was just trying to clarify those sort of things that allows us to move forward with the demonstration projects. So I'm hopeful. What I would really encourage the utilities to do is think about which of these demonstration projects can really be growable, applicable, usable in the future. We just don't need another pilot that's been done 114 times before that gets put back on the shelf when we're done, but that we actually learn something and that we can perhaps apply it more broadly in the future if it really does work.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner.
I so agree with what you said, Gary. That was really good. We've been down a road before of the unknown when we did the EAPS proceeding. And so the chair had mentioned my favorite word, flexibility. But then again, to get on with it, we need to get on with it. And then we need to look at what works best. And that's why we need that flexibility. So I think we're heading down the road, and we know there are going to be bumps in the road, but we're prepared to deal with that when that occurs. And I'm pleased to see about the consumer protections. We all want our consumers to be involved, but we also want to make sure that our consumers not only gain benefit, but also are protected. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I echo Commissioner Akinpur, well said. These are intended to be broad guidelines to provide guidance on some of the issues that I think people, when they're looking at demonstration projects, are saying, well, what is a demonstration project? What are we trying to demonstrate? And that's why I think that the staff in articulating this really is looking at, this isn't about showing us a particular technology. It really is about how this business model will work, how will customers respond, what kind of things should we be doing. And again, I think getting the experience, one of the things that entrepreneurs will tell you is, 9 out of the 10 ideas fail. and we can't afford to fail big, but taking measured steps, trying things, and then managing them and fixing them is a good way for us all to learn as we move forward. And I think that, for me, that getting that experience will be very, very valuable. So I do think I am supportive of it. With that,
Quickly?
yes.
Yeah, I think that you just raised a very important point. And I hope by telling the utilities to go out and do demonstration projects, if they don't work, a acceptable solution is they don't work.
Right.
And they will have spent money on it. That's okay. And I think we should all go in with that understanding that they don't have to come in and prove every demonstration project they spent money on worked in order to be, let's use the word prudent. They just have to prove it was a project that was worth attempting, and we're going to be monitoring that as we go along. But I think it's a very important point, so I just wanted to reiterate it.
Yeah.
And I would just like to comment, if I can, Chair. So I just want to clarify that I am not against demonstration projects. I'm actually very supportive of demonstration projects, but I don't know that we need to direct them to do demonstration projects following these guidelines. Tammy Mitchell talked about ongoing activities that utilities are working on. Folks have come in and talked about it. So for me, I just don't want it to somehow hamper the innovation and the ongoing discussions out there with the utilities and others in the market in terms of putting forth things, trying to fit ideas into what they see as our guidance. And when I read the guidance principles, my concern is that it will also raise a lot more questions about what do they mean about that, how much do they want this, and I just don't want folks to spend time so focusing on trying to read the tea leaves that they miss the objective that I think that the chair has, which is bring us very good ideas and show us how you think you can work with them to really do what our policy objectives are.
Okay. Thank you. And I think in all things it's a balance. We absolutely want folks to feel that that they should bring forward all good ideas. At the same time, I think it's important that the Commission identify some of the things that they feel are going to be most valuable in the demonstration, so that when they are being designed, we don't have to spend a lot of time on things that we would say, well, we're not quite sure why you're doing that. And so this was an attempt to sort of provide an indication of the types of things we'd like to achieve without necessarily precluding any good idea that we might not have thought about. But with that, let me, there's nothing else, we'll move to a vote. All those in favor of the recommendation to adopt a resolution on REV demonstration programs as described by Ms. Mitchell, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstain?
I abstain.
There being 4 ayes and 1 abstention, the recommendation is adopted. Okay, the next item is in connection item 302, and that's the matter of developing demand response tariffs for electric distribution utilities, presented by Steve Keller. Welcome. Steve is Chief of our Special Initiatives in the Office of Electric, Gas, and Water. And all things demand response. Not all, but
Not
many.
all things. We have a lot of good people working in that area. Good morning, Chair Zippelman, Commissioners. Item 302 is a draft order that would institute a proceeding to begin the development and implementation of distribution-level demand response programs and other dynamic load management programs with the goal of deferring or avoiding the need for distribution or bulk power, ultimately bulk power also, infrastructure, improving system efficiency, and providing customers with another set of options for managing their electric bills. The order would direct staff to initiate a cooperative consultative process involving utilities and other stakeholder parties. The initial goal of the proceeding would be the development of a basic set of demand response tariffs by all jurisdictional electric distribution utilities. Tariffs implementing these programs would be filed within 90 days of your order being issued. The longer-term goal of this proceeding would be for staff and the stakeholder group to develop other innovative dynamic load management program proposals that further address market needs. Ultimately, staff would coordinate its work on dynamic load management with work in related proceedings, including work related to successor tariffs. This proposal stems in part from the Commission's 2009 consideration of the value of distribution-level demand response programs, and in part from the staff straw proposal on Track 1 issues issued in the REV proceeding. Con Edison has successfully operated distribution-level demand response programs since 2009 and revised and expanded them in response to the Commission's directives in Case 09E0115. Consistent with the 2009 orders, the straw proposal recommended statewide expansion of distribution-level demand response programs, as well as other programs that will give utilities the capability to perform dynamic load management. These programs are generally considered to be no-regrets, cost-effective approaches, and it would be reasonable to begin their development at this time rather than waiting for the REV proceeding to conclude. Further, by starting now, we can target a summer 2015 startup and begin to accrue their benefits. The goal of this proceeding would also be to ensure as much consistency as possible in the approaches that are taken by our jurisdictional electric utilities. Given that Con Edison has operated successful programs for a good number of years, we recommend that those programs be used as models and lessons learned from those programs be considered going forward. This ties in a little bit to what Commissioner Akamporter said about, the Brooklyn Queens program. You're trying to do it in the hardest possible place. And also the words, if I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere. But that's in another world. So to the extent that there are successful programs operated in other jurisdictions, aspects of those programs should be considered as well. However, the goal of minimizing program differences should be paramount, as variations across utility programs create issues when participants operate in various franchise areas. While the initial goal would involve the development of traditional demand response programs, the longer-term goal would be the development of innovative approaches to demand response needs. The draft order also recommends guidelines for developing these programs. This proceeding does not address demand response programs currently implemented by the New York Independent System Operator, nor those programs contemplated by this order intended as a replacement for those programs. Staff is currently working with the utilities, the New York ISO, and representatives of the demand response community to ensure that important bulk system benefits provided by the New York ISO demand response programs remain available next summer. With that, I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yes.
Just the line between the distribution system and the transmission system. I see Diane Barney back there, and I know we've spent a few moments doing this along the way. But it's certainly never clear, and I just want to be sure. One of the things that's not kind of transferable from New York City to upstate is we've got a lot of industrial customers upstate. Mm-hmm. Is their status in terms of where they exist in terms of the distribution versus the bulk power system related to the voltage where they interconnect, or are there other other matters that are going to determine whether they fall under the NISO program or fall under the utility distribution system program?
That's a good question. To the extent that customers do take from the high tension system from different utilities, and they would be, I would think, that they would be part of these programs. The ISO currently has their own programs where they aggregate demand.
I guess I'm
response.
getting to, are there going to be some industrial customers that perhaps didn't qualify before that are now going to be able to participate in this because of they just didn't qualify at the bulk power system level? Maybe I'll look at Raj on that one.
Yeah, I think as you said, Commissioner Brown, there are customers today, even upstate, outside of New York City, who are participating in the ISO various types of programs, SCR or DADRP or DADSP. That said, there are no distribution utility demand response programs in upstate utilities, whereas Con Ed has at least 4 or 5 specific distribution level demand response programs to meet their unique needs, either from a reliability perspective or from an economic perspective. What we need to have done right now is for the other utilities, non-Con Ed utilities, to also get into implementing demand response at the distribution level and get some experience on how to use the demand response to meet their needs. There are needs upstate clearly that can be solved now today through some demand response programs, but they're not being taken advantage of. And I think this is an effort to require them to begin offering those tariffs and work with the DR community in developing the programs. Some of the ISO programs are not necessarily as beneficial to some of the customers. The customers can offer different types of products and services. The ISO programs have particular products and services. So whereas the distribution utilities may have more flexibility in providing different types of products and services that the customers can really offer and take advantage of. So I think this is going to the next step of trying to get the upstate utilities to offer programs that really benefit the system and the customers.
If I can add to that, I know in some parts of the country we've had industrial customers who've actually opted in and become their own load serving entity. In those, I don't know if we have those in New York, but I know that there are some in PJM, and so they are just essentially in the bulk power grid. They're not distribution level customers at all, and they don't pay for distribution system because they're all considered bulk power, their own LSC. What do we call it? LSC?
In terms,
but I don't know. But I think our thinking here is that we're going to design programs that are going to be helpful to the utilities from a reliability standpoint, or the DR, like we do in Con Ed.
Right.
And I would think that we also could develop programs that are easier for load customers to participate in than the traditional ISO-administered programs, because they're really focused on the bulk power system and the needs of the bulk power system, versus here we're going to be focusing more on the needs of the distribution system and load shaping, which means we may be able to offer products that are what I would call more friendly to load, because they may not require the kinds of duration that traditional ISO-administered DR programs do, because they're looking at in terms of overall system reliability. So my thinking is I look at it as a sort of another arrow in the quiver of load who might want to participate in the markets, may find that the rules at the ISO are not impose too much operational risk on them or economic risk on them, and that by getting both the load customers and the aggregators and other providers in working with staff, what I'm hoping is, one, is that we'll be able to develop programs that these folks say, hey, I can invest in this, I can do this. And also, as Steve said, what I think the outcome should be is that we should look for programs that are very similar across the board, so we create the broadest possible market. So the thought being here is a couple things, Gary, as you mentioned. One is there's a lot of uncertainty right now because of 745. So there are a number of customers out there saying, we don't even know if demand response is going to exist moving forward at the ISO level. That is really something that the courts are going to be resolving, and it looks like it may even be headed to the Supreme Court. At the same time, we in New York can't afford not to have demand response and demand management part of our network, because it helps reduce price, and frankly it I think will help with congestion, and it also will help with reliability. So this is what I would say at best is going to be complementary to whatever happens at the ISO markets, and at worst will offer a solution that so that we don't have a point where there's a cliff and those programs somehow get ended,
Right.
and we have no place for these load respondents to go. So what I think is going on, it's a little complicated. On one hand, we're trying to make sure that the ISO programs will continue, and I know we have ongoing efforts in that regard. At the same time, we want to start, I think the idea of building up these programs for the retail customers so that we're starting to create these markets is good.
I just
No, I know, but that's...
I want to clarify, besides the existing customers that already play
These could be new
at the
customers.
ISO that have the uncertainty related to the court decisions, I think we're opening up the universe to some smaller industrials or large commercials that may not have qualified. And hopefully that's an area where we can explore that'll be a little different than New York City, because it may be a real win-win, cost-effective for some of the industrial sites to turn down the line at peak times and at the same time get paid and make more money not
Right.
running than they're running. And so I think it helps on both ends of the thing.
Oh, I do, and I think that something that we can do that the ISO may not do is that if a customer says, "Look, I can participate, but I can only do it at an hour at a time. I can't do it for 4 hours." This is our opportunity to understand what are the imperfections in the wholesale market that we can make the retail market work a little easier for customers. So I knew that was your point, but I did want to note that it's, to me, it's a complementary activity on both.
Let me just add to that. I think recently we are finding out, Commissioner Brown, that as generators are retiring or some load is growing in certain pockets upstate, there's unique needs, and demand response could play a big role. Those that's not participating in the ISO, and the utilities today are not capable or don't have the tariffs in place even to accommodate that quickly in a hurry. So I think it's a good time to get some experience.
Yes, it's a obviously exciting time. Any further comments?
I have one comment on the item, and that's that I'm particularly pleased with the amount of collaboration that we've agreed to do going forward. I think that's very important in making this work. But on the topic of Order 745 at FERC and the possible cliff if the courts were to divest FERC of all demand response authority, does that mean it would pour down to us, and do we have some contingency planning going on in case we have to pick up that load?
Yes, a contingency plan is being developed, and we should have some. We are going through a collaborative process, as Steve said, working with the ISO and the demand response community and the utilities, and we should have some results in the coming months. We don't want any gap between the ISO programs falling off and not having a state program in place.
Mr. Berman.
I just want to clarify. This is not my understanding. This is not a response to 745. This is activities. We had 2009 order. I wasn't on the commission then, that laid out some policies, and this is dealing with that demand management programs and looking at what Con Ed currently has, and now looking at it from a statewide perspective, not locking people into doing exactly what Con Ed does. And that the reason for this is we have summer 2005 goal in mind for reliability perspective, and so the necessity of doing this item is imperative for us to do that, and sort of dusting off the 2009 policies with some more guidance and letting folks know, because they do need this order to begin that process, but that the ISO programs are sort of on a separate activity track that we are looking at and working with the stakeholders in that process, and it's not meant to replace the ISO programs. Rather, they should be complementary and working with the relevant stakeholders. I do think it's important that when we come back to look at these programs that we have collaborated with all the relevant stakeholders, and it's very important that we get the expertise from the ISO, even though these are not their programs, to the extent that they can be helpful to us with these, and also looking at the expertise that they can provide overall, because I think it it will be very, very valuable to us and the stakeholders. So I am in support of this item to the extent that we are instituting this proceeding and setting forth that we're looking at these. And the one question I am that I do have is related to the next steps and the process. So there's a 90-day window, but then what's the next step after that?
So to answer your first question, not only do we need the expertise of the ISO, but we need the cooperation and working together with them. Even in the Con Ed distribution level demand response programs, we had pretty good cooperation. And there are overlaps or gaps. We need to make sure those are addressed. So we will continue to work with the ISO as part of this. Within the 90 days, we hope we'll have some good ideas looking at Con Ed's and other jurisdictions' experience. And utilities will take that and file tariffs in 90 days. That will be then put out for comment, and then they'll come back to the Commission for action so that the programs can be implemented in summer 2015. That's the goal.
But people will have an opportunity to comment
on the file tariffs,
okay.
yes.
Thank you very much. This is helpful.
Sure. And I think that as I understand it, the intent is that this will not be a one-stop activity. We are going to have the initial focus for this summer and then continue on. In a way, this is the beginning of a market development. I think it is important that we are doing this in a collaborative, and the collaborative is really focused on how do we develop the products. Of one of the things that we talk about is the day one type markets. The idea is that we do have experience with the Con Ed programs. That's a good place to start. And part of the discussion then will be, should these be implemented statewide? Should they be modified and then implemented? And of course, within that context, we would have to address, do we change the existing Con Ed programs or just let them continue and have slight variations, because we don't want to create disruptions unnecessarily. So I appreciate the need to get people in a room to think this through, but it is important, I think, and valuable for the state that we get moving on these earlier and continue to develop the market as we go. So I appreciate everyone's comments and recognition, too, of the importance of the ISO in this process. With that, there are no further comments. I'd like to take a vote then. All those in favor of instituting a proceeding to develop a dynamic load management programs and convene a stakeholder group for that purpose, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, the recommendation is adopted. So our next matter is item 301, which is regarding our net metering caps, and Tina Palmero is Chief of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Environment, and Len Van Ryn, Managing Attorney, will be presenting that. Good morning, Tina and Len. Please begin.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair, and greetings, Commissioners. Item 301 before you lays out recommendations in response to the petitions and comments filed in Case 14E0151 and 14E0422. The petitioners request that the Commission take action on the net metering minimum purchase caps under the Commission's jurisdiction. I will address recommendations specific to the cap and also tee up some other issues that are ripe for future collaborative discussions. I will then turn it over to Len Van Ryn to address some specific net metering interconnection issues that have been raised in comments. So just by way of background, New York's net metering law allows consumers to install clean distributed generation systems to reduce their bills and allows them to receive a credit for excess generation which flows back to the grid. It's available on a first-come, first-served basis to customers of New York's major investor-owned utilities, subject to technology, system size, and aggregate capacity limitations in each service territory. Currently, the minimum purchase caps are set at 3% for all the IOUs. The Commission, in its April 2014 New York Sun order, recognized that the current 3% caps would not be sufficient to support the significantly expanded solar PV energy capacity goals of New York Sun, and requested that the utilities modify their caps if at risk of exceeding it to avoid any market disruptions. Also in that order, the Commission acknowledged the new REV proceeding that had been recently launched, and it requested that NYSERDA, in consultation with staff, undertake a study to estimate the cost and benefits of net metering and discuss approaches to valuing solar PV to better harmonize with the objectives in the new REV proceeding. And that study is currently underway. The petitioners, however, seeking more market certainty as they try to ramp up their solar PV businesses, requested clarification of the process of ensuring that caps were raised in a timely manner. A request was also made to increase the cap in the Central Hudson Territory to 12%. Some comments received in response to the petitions supported raising the caps now to ensure the goals of New York Sun could be met. Others cautioned that wholesale increases in the caps for all utilities are premature considering the work going on in the REV proceeding. Recently, Central Hudson filed notice that its 3% cap will be exceeded in the near future, and staff notes that National Grid will exceed its cap if all projects in its queue are interconnected. However, both utilities are continuing to process interconnection applications for net metering per the Commission's guidance in the April New York Sun order. So since those utilities are at or near their cap, staff recommends that the Commission increase the caps for all utilities to 6% effective immediately to provide sufficient room for growth while successor tariffs are considered and developed in the REV proceeding. Assuming all additional net metering capacity is solar generation, doubling the caps from 3% to 6% will likely result in an additional company-wide average delivery impact of between 0.5% and 1.3%, depending on the utility, if the 6% caps were reached. Staff finds that this impact is reasonable, and doubling the caps allows sufficient headroom to advance the goals of New York Sun and also development of other net meter distributed energy resources, while these successive measures are developed in the REV proceeding and are ultimately implemented. Staff closely monitors the caps of the IOUs and recommends that the Commission continue to ensure that no gap be allowed to open between the time that caps are fulfilled and any new successor tariffs that may commence. Staff also recommends consideration of a number of other initiatives by seeking stakeholder input to further promote solar and other DER facilities. In particular, there is a strong interest in community net metering, where customers who are otherwise unable to site facilities on their premises for various reasons would join in constructing a facility up to 2 megawatts at a location where net metering can take place. An example of how this could potentially play out is included in the draft before you. There is also interest in addressing retail rate credits for all distributed generation resources, including fuel cells, which locate in priority areas. So the same kind of action that the Commission has been asked to take in the preceding presentations on these locational benefits could be extended to all distributed energy resources. And with that, we would ask that utilities in this consultative process identify locations that would have beneficial results for the grid. And this is, again, something that would be done in a consultative process. Also, as stated earlier, staff and NYSERDA are currently working together to complete a report on net metering and approaches for valuing solar. Staff anticipates that this report will inform a more detailed analysis that will help develop any successor measures and tariffs envisioned in REV. Therefore, it's recommended that staff and NYSERDA continue to work together on approaches for pricing and valuing distributed energy resources in a collaborative process. The draft item before you also addresses some other important issues relating to the implementation of net metered projects, particularly with respect to remote net metering. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Len Van Ryn to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Len.
Good morning. I'm going to address the legal issues that have been raised regarding compliance with the 2 megawatt limit that the Public Service Law imposes on the size of net metered facilities, and regarding statutory requirements on the cost of interconnecting those facilities. I believe it is. Can I be heard?
It's not a loud mic. Use as much as you can.
Is that better?
Yes.
Thank you.
Because you're talking about the 6
You and I are about the only ones who've been here long enough to remember. Net metering is intended to foster the development of many small environmentally beneficial facilities widely distributed across utility service territories. The 2 megawatt requirement is one of the means by which that goal is achieved. Consequently, building a utility scale facility concentrated at one geographic location and then attempting to divide that larger facility into 2 megawatt segments does not comply with the intent of the 2 megawatt requirement and does not fit within the goals that net metering is intended to accomplish. The net metering statute itself is written in terms that contemplate that each 2 megawatt facility would be separately located at a separate site. Commission precedent on size limitations in other contexts also supports an interpretation that each 2 megawatt facility must be sited independently. The Commission has previously decided in other contexts where a 2 megawatt requirement has been imposed that splitting larger size generators into multiple 2 megawatt segments at the same site is impermissible because it would fail to satisfy the policies behind establishing a 2 megawatt requirement in the first place. Consequently, the Commission should establish standards that must be met to show that a facility meets the 2 megawatt requirement. Compliance with that requirement would be achieved by showing that each 2 megawatt facility is separately metered and interconnected to the utility grid, is located at a separate site, and operates independently of other facilities. That the meter and interconnection are separate can be determined by showing that the interconnection is made at a single point where no more than 2 megawatts is connected behind one meter. If any interconnection or other non-utility owned electric equipment or property is shared between facilities, then the 2 facilities would be deemed combined for purposes of determining compliance with the 2 megawatt limit. Each remote net metered facility must also be separately sited. That can be defined through application of well-established property law principles. Consequently, only one 2 megawatt facility may be located on a parcel as described in a properly recorded deed. As the remote net metering statute provides, a customer may then qualify by either leasing or owning that underlying parcel. Owners could also subdivide a larger property into separately deeded parcels where separate facilities would be located, so long as other requirements for determining compliance with the 2 megawatt limit are met. Each 2 megawatt project must also be operationally separate. While one company may operate a number of facilities that are separately sited, their operation must be separately directed independently of each other. Successful participants in recent NYSERDA and New York City renewable solicitations, however, may not have been aware of these requirements or their implications. The reasonable expectations of successful participants in those solicitations should not be disrupted if they can show they made a good faith effort to comply with the 2 megawatt limit. Utilities should be directed to work with those successful solicitation participants who acted in good faith to interconnect their project proposals. As with other net metering matters, dispute resolution is available through consultation with staff or petition to the Commission. The Public Service Law also establishes the requirements for determining when net meter generators must bear system upgrade costs downstream from the generator's location. Where a net meter generator's capacity exceeds 20% of the capacity of the local feeder line to which it is connected, the generator becomes responsible for those downstream upgrades needed to accept delivery of its electricity. This includes the cost of any substation upgrades that must be performed because of the generator. However, the 20% limitation does not establish a ceiling on the proportion of generator capacity to local feeder line capacity. Rather, the 20% limitation establishes when an analysis of downstream upgrades is needed. That analysis is directed to determining the upgrades and costs that are reasonably necessary for the safety and reliability of the system. As a result, the proportion of generator capacity to feeder line capacity may be greater than 20% if the line can be operated safely and reliably at the higher proportion after the needed upgrades are installed. Finally, I'll address a rate design flaw that has created an arbitrage situation for net metered customers that needs to be corrected. Remote net metering often takes place at sites where non-demand rates are in place. Those rates consist primarily of a volumetric component. But remote net metered customers have been permitted to convert the volumetric credits they would otherwise receive into monetary credits. In comparison, if a non-demand customer were to install net metering at its site, it would not be able to receive monetary credits and instead would receive only volumetric credits at that site. In addition, customers net metering on-site at an existing demand metered location are credited at the volumetric rate for that demand classification, which is comparatively quite a bit lower than non-demand volumetric rates because of the demand charge. The result is the creation of uneconomic arbitrage opportunities. As customers pursue remote net metering, where they can convert comparatively high volumetric credits into monetary credits, instead of on-site net metering, where they can't convert or are credited at lower volumetric amounts. Therefore, electric utilities should be directed to file tariffs that substitute volumetric crediting for monetary crediting at non-demand remote net metered locations. This will place remote and on-site locations on a more equal footing and discourage uneconomic arbitrage. Again, however, net metering developers that have pursued installation of solar in good faith should not find their financial expectations disrupted by this change in policy. As a result, utilities should be required to structure their tariffs such that the successful participants in the NYSERDA and New York City solicitations we've discussed, existing remote net metered facilities, and customers that have entered into binding interconnection agreements for remote net metering that have been queued by the utilities as of the December 11, 2014 date of this session may continue with monetary crediting. We are available for questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done. Complicated issues. Just a couple questions. When we're putting the limitation on the 2 megawatt limit, that is not doesn't preclude anyone from participating in the New York Sun. It's really just a limitation on their entitlement to net metering payments. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, so I want to be clear on that, so that and we would expect them to participate in those solicitations. The other element I wanted to talk a little bit about is how we're going to proceed with these 2 collaboratives that you're recommending, because as you mentioned, Tina, and I think Steve alluded to too. I mean, these are not only like 2 sides of one pancake, they're really the same pancake. We're talking about how do we value load reductions in the market. And so I would expect, as we move forward, both on the dynamic load management collaboratives and thinking about the successor tariffs, necessarily we're going to have to think about them as one and the same, because ultimately we're looking at how do you price out load response, load management on the system, and if we move 2 parallel tracks, we're going to have to bring them back together at some point. So I would think that as you're moving forward, we think about how we structure this work, so that we get the right people in the room and we can try to work on these simultaneously. Otherwise, I think it's going to be more chaotic than it feels on some days. Is that what you were thinking, or were you thinking something else? Or haven't we gotten that far?
Well, I would say, generally speaking, yes. There is a need to reflect certain benefits, certain things that you gain from all these programs, and they all do have to somehow or other come together. So whatever we develop is going to have to work across the programs. Absolutely, yes.
And I would probably add, as we move forward with REV, we have the overall issues of cost-benefit analyses, and they all need to be linked. It's a series of highly interconnected Venn diagrams, I would think. Okay, with that, I think from my perspective, the couple things that we're doing today that I think are important are the fact that we're providing some level of market confidence and continuity. There is, I know, an ongoing concern always of, well, if we want to attract people to this market, if they're concerned that we're going to hit caps and therefore maybe I should go elsewhere, we want to provide that assurance that we are moving forward on our with the net metering program, so that the caps are high enough. At the same time, we are, I think, doing 2 things that are very valuable. One is looking at community solar, an experience that we've learned about in other states. This is very valuable, and we've heard in New York particularly that there's so many customers who may live in multi-unit housing, who may be in areas that they really aren't available for solar, or in fact have economic limitations, that they aren't able to put photovoltaic on their homes, but that they can participate in a community-based program and therefore get some of the advantages. So for all of those reasons, I think it's of great value for us to move forward, and I highly support that recommendation. And then on the third point, I think, as I mentioned, is it is important that we now, in one hand, provide the continuity of the existing programs, and then also start working on, well, what's the successor tariffs. So again, these things are complicated, they take time. We know from sort of the literature we get across the board, a lot of states have done this, and it's created a huge amount of agitas and uncertainty and problems, and I'd like to think that New York, through this collaborative process, will develop the right path forward and provide, with having the right people in the room, the opportunity to create programs that are economically and environmentally sustainable as we think about distributed energy as including solar as a key element to what we are driving as the future of this industry. So I think, again, timing is right. We need to get this going. We need to get the right people in the room. And I leave it to staff with the support of NYSERDA to figure out how to orchestrate this so that these are constructive dialogues that move forward at a pace that allow us to drive to conclusions in reasonable time frames. So with that, I am supportive of the recommendations, and I would open up for other questions or comments.
Thank you. When I look at this, I go back to what is our authority for being able to increase the caps. And the Public Service Law does lay out very clearly that the Commission has the authority to increase the net metered minimum purchase cap if it determines that additional net metering and net energy metering is in the public interest. So the threshold question to me is this in the public interest? And when I look at it, I can see an argument being made that it's in the public interest for the two utilities that are about to reach their cap because of the concerns we have with upsetting things right now and having people to be able to participate in that. I'm not so sure that we can make a legitimate argument, though I understand that all the cap has to be raised for all utilities. And then for me, I then question, if we do that, what then, when will we start addressing the issues with net metering that we need to look at, especially since this order talks about going to a transition to a value tariff. So I'm concerned that we aren't sort of getting to the meat of the issues, and that we are doing this, and maybe it's time, because we have talked about it throughout the years, about really delving in, rolling up our sleeves, and getting to some of the issues with net metering that we need to. I'm more than happy to do that and to dig down deep. One of the issues for me is this order does talk a lot about the New York Sun order, and this is a further order in bringing out some of those issues with New York Sun as it relates to net metering. I completely understand that. I did abstain from the New York Sun order, and for me, I feel I need to abstain from this as well, especially because there is an ongoing study that staff is working with NYSERDA on, and I would rather, I think it's more prudent for me to wait for that study and to really delve deep into this and deal with it more holistically. I am very happy with this order in that it is trying to look at the transition and dealing with those issues. So I think ultimately we're on the same page, but I am uncomfortable with this item to vote yes on it. So I will be abstaining.
Okay. Thank you. Just as from a timing perspective, I think that the idea here is that we start with the collaborative so that we're in a position that we have the successor tariff in place well before we hit the caps, and so that we can create the path forward so that there's no market disruption. I think it will be helpful. I'm not sure we lay out the timing in this order, but I believe that the next step is really the formation of the collaborative and then coming back to the Commission with an anticipation of the timing of when things will get done, so that we can then not only start the clock, but monitor and make sure that if the collaborative processes get bogged down, we can help make sure we unbog them. So, if that's a word, but that to me would be the next step in the collaborative is setting the schedule. With any other comments?
I think this decision, particularly in the intricacies explained by Mr. Van Ryn, sets a good precedent. that with our policy changes, we do not intend to strip away the economic benefits of good faith investments in new technology. We can't decide now what the prospective or retrospective impact of our future decisions is going to be, but I hope this particular technical decision sends a signal that New York is open for innovation, and potential market players should not be looking at REV as a chilling overhang.
Further comments? Okay, well then let's move on this. So item number 301. All those in favor of the recommendation to raise net metering minimum purchase caps for solar and other facilities as described, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstain?
I will be abstaining.
Okay. With 4 ayes and 1 abstention, the recommendation is adopted. Thank you. Let's take a 10-minute break. First of all, I want to thank the panelists today. I do think that these are very complex orders. They're very well drafted, very thoughtful, and look forward to... Oh, wait. I do want to do... I'm sorry, guys. I know you got excited. We have one more. CCN. So let's do the community aggregation, then take a break. I knew there was one. Yeah. This is almost like if you have too many children, you're going to neglect one of them eventually. But we don't want to neglect you. So the fifth item that is in this group is item 203. And that's regarding the matter of enabling community choice aggregation. And that will be presented by Luann Scher, who is our chief of our consumer advocacy. And Ted Kelly, who's assistant counsel, is also available for questions on this matter. Luann, please begin.
So good afternoon, Chair Zibelman and Commissioners. Item 203 recommends that the Commission initiate a proceeding on community choice aggregation. As we discussed at the July 10th Technical Conference on REV, Community Choice Aggregation, or CCA, is an alternative model for customers to participate in the retail market. CCA involves the aggregation of electricity or gas load by a municipality on behalf of the municipality's residents. The models employed by the states that have implemented CCA vary, but generally the municipality or its consultant receives data from the utility, issues an RFP for an ESCO to serve the load based on the municipality's needs, selects the ESCO, and then provides information to residents regarding the CCA and explains how they can opt out of the CCA program if they are not interested. Customers are enrolled by the winning ESCO, who would be subject to the same uniform business practices that all other ESCOs have to abide by, with a few exceptions. In CCA, customer-specific data must be transmitted from the distribution utility to the municipality, which is not currently provided for in the UBP. In addition, customer authorization for enrollment in CCA would not be required because it is an opt-out program. CCA has been implemented in at least 6 states and has resulted in lower and/or stable prices and attractive terms for customers due to the bargaining power that aggregation provides. CCA can also allow a municipality to set its own energy goals, which could include price stability, increased reliance on green energy products, or support for local generation. Staff recommends that the Commission initiate a proceeding to explore the possibility of enabling CCA in New York. Staff also recommends that the Commission issue for comment a list of questions that are intended to gather information from stakeholders and interested parties, including, for example, the New York Conference of Mayors and Municipal Officials. These questions are designed to obtain information regarding the interest in CCA and the benefits, costs, risks, and necessary protections associated with CCA, including issues such as the appropriate notice to customers and the duration of the opt-out period. After reviewing the comments on these issues, staff may come back to the Commission with a recommendation in the spring. I also wanted to take a minute to discuss an item on the consent agenda. Item 264 recommends adoption of a proposal which would allow an electric customer to switch to an energy supplier if the enrollment is received by the utility within 5 days of the meter read. If adopted, this will significantly reduce the enrollment period for electric customers. We are also recommending a collaborative to develop proposals for accelerated switching for gas enrollments and for off-cycle switching. That ends my presentation, and Ted and I are available for questions.
Thank you. So the matter before us and in the proceeding, I think staff has done a good job in laying out both the legal issues associated with this, plus the pros and cons. I mean, this we've had from what we've seen, and is that community aggregation, when done right, can provide a very important benefit where the markets, as we've seen, have not been able to serve residential and small commercial customers. They are providing a vehicle for these customers to get, both through the value of aggregation, the ability to get lower prices or better products or even green products in a way that reduces the cost. So it is almost like the Brooklyn Queens concept, the folks working in the commons to provide a good for all, and I think that it is definitely worth exploring. I want to, in noting this, that we are initiating this proceeding, really recognize the fact that the whole dialogue around community aggregations began last year when Assemblywoman Paulin began looking at this issue and began looking at it in the context of legislative change or developing a demonstration. I applaud her leadership in this, and it certainly got us thinking in the context of REV about why shouldn't we do this. It's a great way to get local units in government engaged with their customers. It's a great way to get customers an opportunity to work, individual customers to work in a community setting, but that there, like every other things, there are pros and there are cons, and that we need to make sure in designing what we do in the state, if we move forward, are take advantage of the experiences elsewhere and get all these advantages in New York. Again, I think that by opening this proceeding, we're opening the dialogue, we're providing comments, we have an opportunity now to think about how we will design such a program going forward and then move forward with it. So I look at this as a further development, another vehicle to get consumers engaged, and our experience in New York, particularly after Sandy and what we saw in the New York Rising, communities are very anxious to think about how they can help themselves, and giving them an opportunity, municipalities, to work to get with their residents and provide a value, I think, in the energy sector is a good thing. So with that, I'm looking forward to the comments. I'm prepared to open this proceeding, and again, thank you, staff, for a very thoughtful approach and very careful elucidation of the issues and a way to move this forward. With that, I'll open it for any other comments.
Thank you. Community choice aggregation is something that we can take very seriously. I think, as Chair Zibelman said, Assemblywoman Paulin took a leadership role in this, and both the Senate and the Assembly really looked at the issues and stepped up on what might be able to be done. And this is an item that attempts to take it further and look at it from a statewide perspective. Some of my concerns are that the devils are in the details with community choice aggregation and really needing to do a significant deep dive into the issues. 6 states have adopted it. I've looked at those 6 states, and I know that there needs to be a lot more analysis done on the 6 states that have adopted it through legislation, and it has changed in each state. It is not a one-size-fits-all. There are differences, there are successes, but there are also some huge pitfalls, and not all states have been successful, and even the ones that may have some successful programs have experienced some problems with it. So So I think that staff has done a very, very good job here in laying out the issues, issuing the staff white paper as part of this order. I am going to abstain on this because I really do think that it's very important that we go very, very carefully, and I will be very much assuming that this passes, that we really have a very much focus on making sure that we look at the pros and the cons and work through all of the issues and even the unintended consequences, so that we are not after the fact saying, well, we didn't think about that. So that it's very, very important, especially because municipalities will be involved in this, and they're each, it's not a one-size-fits-all for each municipality. And again, the type of programs that are there, I think it's really with extreme caution in doing this, and focusing on it from our perspective as really being the ones to help in these issues. So I just really can't overemphasize that enough. So I will be abstaining, but I look forward to working with folks on this issue.
Further questions, comments?
Well, I've read where some of the other states have had problems, but here again, this is New York. And if we work hard at giving benefit and giving the consumer another good tool to put in their toolbox, that's not a bad thing. So I think it's good to institute the proceeding. I will be very interested in seeing the comments, and let's see where we go from there. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, it's I don't know how we move forward without moving forward. So, while I recognize there are challenges when you're trying to do something new, our way of looking at things is to open proceedings, open dockets, so that we can examine the issues. And I think that it's a necessary first step is to the inquiry, to making sure we get the comments in and look at it. So with that, I would like to take this to a vote. So all those in favor of item number 203, which is the matter of enabling community choice aggregation, please institute a proceeding to examine enabling community choice aggregation programs and solicit comments as described. Please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstain?
I will be abstaining.
4 ayes and 1 abstention. We will move forward. Thank you. So now we will take a 10-minute break. All right. So we are now moving into item 6 on the agenda, which is item 303. And that's our proceeding to examine alternating current transmission upgrades. Dave Drexler, Assistant Counsel, will be presenting that. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. This is not the first time this proceeding has been before you, and nor will it be the last. But because it's been a while since you've addressed these matters, allow me to give you a little bit of the background, how we got here. In November of 2012, the Commission initiated this proceeding to investigate potential solutions to the transmission congestion that's persistent between upstate and downstate. This is commonly referred to as the Central East and Upstate New York, Southeast New York, or UPNY-SENY electrical interfaces. As the Commission recognized at that time, upgrades to those sections of the transmission system could produce various benefits to New York, including enhancing system reliability, flexibility, and efficiency, reducing environmental and health impacts, increasing diversity in supply, promoting job growth and the development of new, efficient generation resources upstate, and mitigating reliability problems that may arise with expected generation retirements. In response to the Commission's inquiry, several interested developers submitted competing proposals for consideration. In the course of reviewing those projects, parties requested clarification as to the process the Commission would use in determining which project or portfolio of the projects best achieves the Commission's objectives. Parties also sought clarification as to how the projects would be coordinated with the New York Independent System Operator's public policy planning process, and how the costs associated with the projects would be allocated and recovered. To address the requests for clarification, advisory staff proposed that trial staff develop a report for the Commission's consideration that includes a comparative evaluation of the proposed projects. Trial staff's evaluation would consider various criteria, such as the costs of the projects, the associated reliability and economic benefits, electrical system impacts, and environmental impacts, including but not limited to visual impacts. Based on this evaluation, the Commission would identify a preferred project or portfolio of projects that should proceed through the siting process under Article 7 of the Public Service Law. Advisory staff also recommended that the projects be evaluated under the NYSO's public policy planning process, which provides an opportunity for developers to recover their costs pursuant to tariffs approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. A methodology for allocating costs was also proposed, whereby the primary beneficiaries of the projects, which are expected to be downstate, would be allocated 90% of the costs, and the remaining 10% of the costs would be allocated to ratepayers upstate. Lastly, advisory staff suggested a mechanism for sharing the risks of cost overruns, whereby a developer would bear 20% of the cost overruns and ratepayers would bear the other 80% of those costs. This would also be accompanied by other provisions, such as conditions on incentive returns sought from FERC. On August 13th of this year, the Commission sought comments on the advisory staff recommendations that I just mentioned. Several parties raised concerns with respect to the need for additional transmission facilities to relieve congestion, given other initiatives such as REV. Other comments indicated that the proposed projects will cost too much in relation to alternative technologies or resources. Parties also raised concerns with the environmental impact of the additional facilities, particularly visual impacts, and the impacts on property values and agricultural lands. With respect to the process recommended by advisory staff, parties generally sought additional transparency and opportunities to participate and provide comments. With some exceptions, parties generally supported a cost recovery mechanism through FERC tariffs and the concept of beneficiaries' pay. The item being presented for your consideration today seeks to respond to the parties' comments by addressing up front the basis of the need for these projects. The project proponents would be expected to submit information necessary to assess the project's benefits and costs. Based on this information and its own analysis, trial staff would evaluate the relative merits of the projects and would provide an overall assessment of the benefits and costs of the various projects. Trial staff would present its findings at a technical conference open to all parties, which would be able to submit comments thereafter. The process would also seek to align these proceedings with the NYSO's public policy planning process. Public comments are currently being solicited in case 14E0454 on several proposed public policy requirements, including the AC transmission upgrades under consideration in these proceedings. This approach would also provide a mechanism, if necessary, for projects to recover their costs under a FERC-approved tariff. The proposed item would adopt the cost allocation and risk-sharing methodologies in the advisory staff recommendations that I noted earlier. In the event that the siting process results in a developer incurring additional costs that are material but could not have been reasonably foreseeable at the time that they formulated their initial bid price, then the risk-sharing mechanism would provide for recovery of those expenses. This concludes my presentation. Staff is available to answer any questions that you may have, and thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. think that this proceeding, as you mentioned, Dave, has been complex. Has been in front of us several times, and I think as expected, because we're plowing new ground in a lot of different areas. It's looking at the process, making sure it works, has been something that we've been working on for the last year, and I think at this point we are in a good point to move forward and start making some decisions so that we can start seeing some conclusion here in terms of where we're headed. With that, I think why I'm supportive of this is that I do recognize that in looking at the construction of the transmission, there's been considerable concern that the Commission has not paid enough attention to the question of need and in general, and that we needed to build in the opportunity to present information and to really consider, is our moving forward with building transmission something that is of benefit to the state, and are there other alternatives? So rather than waiting until the Article 7 proceeding in Part B, I do think it makes sense to have this technical conference, to get the issues aired out and see and give people an opportunity to present the information. And I would expect that that would come back to us as some sort of interim decision, and that will allow for folks to move forward and with confidence one way or another. So I do think that this is a value, something we hadn't contemplated originally, but given what we've learned about not just the visual impact, but actually the impairment on property value just because of the uncertainty, and people trying to understand what we're doing. I think it'll be a value add to get the record, to get the technical conference, and get the information out there. Same time is the challenge that we've been having with the developers. Again, life would have been easy if we simply said to the transmission owners, go out and build transmission and come, and we'll talk about cost allocation, but we did want the advantage of looking at multiple players, which means that we need to start a process now of deciding if there is a single project or multiple projects that seem to make the most sense. We make some early decisions because, again, people are putting a lot of money into this, and it's different than when you just use regulated utilities, because these are people who are putting their own money in. And if they're not selected, there is really no opportunity for them to get recovery. So the faster for them we can make a decision, so they could put their best case forward, and then we can move on, I think is important. So I think that's value. The other thing that's novel here, and I appreciate staff's thoughtfulness in this and the comments we've received, is the issue of price. I mean, if, again, our typical way of doing things with cost of service would mean that we would look at the prudency of the expenses, we would monitor it, we would look at the capital, we would make adjustments if we felt that the companies were not being prudent. But here, we are going to be looking at multiple providers. And so the question then becomes, let's say we pick somebody and they gave us a price, and then they go to build it and it's 3 times more expensive than the next person, and they say, oops. Well, we can't take an oops here, so this is putting more risk. And that's why I think it's important that we balance, because at that point they need to know enough about what they're building so that they can give us bids with a great deal of confidence, and we can do an apples-to-apples comparison. So I think this need to put more risk on the developer than traditionally we do, in the sense of they will have to stick by their bid now. And I think there's always the balance. I don't want to sound like is that if in fact something truly materializes that couldn't have been anticipated, we have to be somewhat realistic, but that would have to be, I think, a fairly heavy burden to prove, because we don't want people putting in bids that are necessarily biased towards being very, I would say, optimistic, and then suddenly say, oh, I didn't think about the fact that I'm actually going to have to buy equipment. Forgot that in my bid. So I think this is a good way of approaching it. To me, then, what we're going to see then, and just to be clear on it procedurally, the staff is expecting that the technical conference will happen sometime in the spring. Is that correct?
That's right, in the mid-June timeframe.
Okay. I think that, this makes sense. It's a good path forward. Also takes advantage of the ISO public policy practice in a good way to get the cost allocation. And I know that there were many, many heads being knocked together as we tried to go through this. So I appreciate all the work that the staff and the parties have done in trying to figure out how to navigate these issues. And I believe we've ended up in a good spot. So I'm very supportive of the recommendation. Any further comments or questions? Okay. You spend long enough, so good. Let's move. This is a complex matter, and I know we'll move forward. The other thing that I would say is, in looking at these issues, we've talked before about this, and I do want to make clear that the issue of visual impact, if we decide to move ahead with transmission, continues to be a major issue, and I know the parties have looked at it, but I again want to urge everyone in looking at their proposals that they think about how technology can be used to either eliminate or certainly minimize the impact on the local community. It is always a difficult issue, and hopefully we will find a good way forward. So with that, let's take a vote, and I need to find my notes. So this is item 303, and with all those in favor of the recommendations of staff to adopt a comparative evaluation process and the modified procedural schedule, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? There being no opposition, the recommendation is adopted. Thank you very much. The next item for discussion is item 101, and that is the petition of Keyspan Gas East Corporation, National Grid, for authority to defer costs associated with incremental capital expenditures and other related relief. Cindy McCarron, who's the Deputy Director of our Office of Electric, Gas, and Water, and Jeff Hogan, Chief of our Office of Accounting, Audits, and Finance, will be presenting this. Cindy, please begin.
Sure. Good afternoon, Chair Zibelman and Commissioners. The company filed a petition requesting authority to establish a mechanism to allow a 3-year, $700 million capital investment program. Their proposal featured replacement of over 250 miles of leak-prone pipe, the installation of over 180 miles of new gas main associated with customer growth, the addition of more than 33,000 new gas customers, and other benefits, while proposing to maintain current base rates. The other benefits that the company included are things such as reduced methane leakage, translating to reduced greenhouse gas emissions, as well as economic development associated with construction activity and energy cost reductions for consumers. Replacement of leak-prone pipe and distribution network improvement and development are both policy initiatives that the Commission has advocated. The draft order before you recommends directing the company to replace 77.5 miles of leak-prone pipe in calendar year 2015 and 95 miles in calendar year 2016. It also recommends for calendar year 2017 that the company propose to replace 115 miles of leak-prone pipe. That would be done either through a rate case filing if the company does that, or if they decline to file for rates, by then they should make another filing to implement this increased ramp-up of leak-prone pipe replacement.
Just get a clarification. Would you define quickly for us leak-prone pipe?
Sure.
Sounds like it's pipe that's maybe leaking.
And it is not necessarily pipe that is leaking right now. It is very clearly defined as pipe that is either cast iron pipe, bare steel or unprotected steel, or a certain type of plastic pipe which is of an older vintage. So very specific, and that's a good point. It is not necessarily leaking right now, but it is prone to it, more so than current pipe. You're welcome.
We could say older infrastructure.
Yeah. So in staff's proposal before you, this would be a total of 287.5 miles of leak-prone pipe replacement in 3 years, compared to the company's proposal of 250 miles. The company would incur, under staff's proposal before you, a negative revenue adjustment of approximately $960,000 in any year that it fails to achieve these goals. Staff also recommends that the company be directed to update its gas safety performance metrics, including institution of a violations performance measure, which both of its sister companies already have, those being Niagara Mohawk Upstate and Keyspan Energy Delivery New York, otherwise known as KEDNY. It is recommended in the draft order that the company be allowed to defer carrying charges associated with attaching almost 11,000 accounts in calendar year 2015 and almost 12,000 new accounts in calendar year 2016. If the company does not meet that new account goal each year, staff recommends that the allowed carrying charges should be reduced proportionally by the number of accounts under the target. The cost of the leak-prone pipe replacement program recommended by staff is about $212 million over the 2-year period. The cost of the distribution network development program, approximately $203 million over the 2-year period. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Hogan now, who's going to talk about the accounting and rate-making treatments associated with staff's recommendations.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jeff.
Good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. Ordinarily, the cost recovery of the projects Cindy outlined would be dealt with in a full rate case. However, the unique circumstances we face with KEDLI means that an alternative rate-making mechanism is needed. Because what we are proposing is for the Commission to order the replacement of specific amounts of leak-prone pipe and the further development of KEDLI's distribution network, the exogenous clause of their current rate plan is triggered. This clause allows the company to defer, for future recovery from customers, any expense associated with legislative or commission mandates. The costs they will be able to defer include a return on the capital expenditure that they are making, as well as the depreciation costs on that new plant. If the capital expenditure forecasts are accurate, then there will be approximately $50 million of deferrals related to the 2 programs that would come about due to this draft order. About $23.6 million of that cost is related to the leak-prone pipe replacement. About $26.5 million is for the development of the company's distribution network. If no surcharge was to be allowed, then in the next rate plan, customers would pay for all of those costs. This would be collected at the same time that all of the new rate base that we would be putting in through the leak-prone pipe, as well as the distribution network improvements, would also be going to the revenue requirement. If the $50 million of deferred costs were collected over 3 years, the bill impact of the amortization, along with the new plant related to the deferral, would be about 3.3%. This is a little under $4 per month per residential customer. This would be coming at the same time all of the other costs that I mentioned regarding plant are also hitting customers, along with the reset of some costs that are currently higher than what are in rates, such as property taxes and pension expenses. In addition, plant put in place in 2013 and 2014 would be part of the revenue requirement calculation for the first time as well. We have a concern that the rate driver pressures could lead to rate shock. The draft order would allow the company to surcharge customers for the leak-prone pipe replacement costs. The surcharge would collect about $23.4 million over the April 2015 to December 2016 time period. Since the SAPA in this case did not cover a surcharge, the draft order directs the company to file tariffs to collect such a surcharge, and after the comment period, the Commission could then implement that charge. The surcharge would have a bill impact of about 1.2%, or about $1.37 per month per residential customer. When the surcharge is over at the end of 2016, it is anticipated that a new rate plan will be about to take effect for the company. The amortization of the deferred costs related to KEDLI developing its distribution network and the new plan and base rates will increase bills. If the deferred amount is collected from customers or amortized over 3 years, then there will be approximately a 1.5% increase over what customers have been paying with the surcharge in place, for a total increase over bills today of about 2.7%. This amount ignores all the other rate drivers other than the construction costs that you would be approving in this draft order. The only other party filing comments in the case was New York City. While they also agree that generally a rate case would be the proper venue for addressing these plant additions, they recognize that the situation is unique and are supportive of both the increased leak-prone pipe replacement and the development of the distribution network within the territory. New York City felt that the surcharge should only be in place about 18 months to 2 years and that a full reconciliation should occur. The draft order is in line with those recommendations. Staff will review the capital expenditures spending, and the draft order has a full reconciliation of the costs up to certain caps. The proposed order also has a limitation to stop the deferrals should the company earn more than 9% on its return on equity. Earning at that level is not expected, as even with the deferral, the company is forecasting to earn about 7% per year. Advisory staff believes that the proposed order balances the advancement of important policy objectives along with ratepayer bill impacts. I would like to thank all of the staff who has worked on this unique case, and if you have any questions, Cindy or I are available to answer them.
Thank you very much. When was the last time that they filed a rate case?
The last case was decided in December 2007. It was a 5-year rate plan. It would be 7 years ago this month.
So we would have expected them to come in 2013, typically?
In February 12, we would have expected a filing normally, and in January 13, they would have been eligible for new rates to go into effect.
This is, I guess it's because it's the season. It's a little bit of like a Christmas story. It's the best of times and the worst of times. Clearly, our preference would be not to do single-issue rate making when you have a company that's been out for this period of time. But the accounting circumstances really are affecting their ability to provide the information necessary to do a full-blown rate case, and while we don't appreciate that, we certainly recognize that. All right, and we recognize that. I would say we all do. But at the same time, I think it is very critical that we do not slow down, and in fact, as we're suggesting here, accelerate the pace of replacement of older pipe. That is a significant safety concern, and I think that no question, we last thing we want is to allow a company's accounting program problems get in the way of where we need to go. But plus, we have the advantage here is that as we're both addressing the safety issues, we're also looking at the development of the distribution plant, which I assume will allow for, and we have goals associated with adding new customers, and that in turn will have the impact of mitigating rate impacts because we'll have a larger customer group by which this capital investment will be spread over. So I think that in that context, it is a great outcome from the perspective of, one, we do what we should be doing is looking at ways to replace older pipe that both addresses safety issues, it also reduces methane production, which I think is very important. The other piece is that the amount of jobs associated with this construction obviously provide a value to the community. And then we also have the potential for new gas customers who are able to switch from oil or propane to have a significant reduction in their overall energy bills. So for all of that, the outcome is right. I think that the approach of taking 2 years with the expectation that the company will be coming in for a full rate case is the right time period. And so for those reasons, I am supportive of us moving forward in this way. Any other comments on this matter? Questions?
Thank you. Thank you, first, staff, for all your hard work. For me, when I look at this issue, and I'm very, very supportive of this item and will be voting in the affirmative, it really comes down to the integrity and reliability of the gas system is paramount. In New York, we're focused on ensuring, one, that we have a safe, 2, reliable, and 3, clean natural gas system. So the 3 prongs, reliability, safety, and a clean natural gas system is very, very important. We have several gas initiatives that we're actively engaged in to achieve all three of these prongs. But we need to also look, and this item does look at that, a reasonable, balanced approach to that. For the industry, they need balance. They want to participate and have an opportunity with their natural gas initiatives. But we also need balance for the ratepayer who wants to have safe, reliable, and clean energy, but at reasonable costs. And then really it's also about balance for the regulator on all these things, because we need to be fair and reasonable and understanding how this all works in real-life application. So for me, when we look at this, and nationally it is being looked at, about how do you replace your leak-prone pipe in a way that is balanced and really make sure that we do have safe and reliable natural gas. And one of the things is to achieve this better compliance with safety is positive incentives, which could be through rates or charges or other mechanisms that really promote the replacement of aging pipelines. Many states also do have currently infrastructure investment replacement incentives, and here for me this is a very good opportunity for us outside the rate case to really be going towards replacement of the leak-prone pipe in a cost-efficient way, and finding innovative ways to finance the replacement of leak-prone pipe is critically important throughout the state. So I look forward to voting yes on this item, and also continuing the dialogue on how we do this throughout the state. So thank you.
Further. Thank you. And just to sort of add a slight addendum, Commissioner Berman, I think your observation is correct. A lot of states are looking at various mechanisms to allow for continued replacement of pipe. I think in this particular context, to me, the fact matters are really predicated on the fact that we needed an exogenous recovery rather than a broad policy. But I do take your point that it is something we as a commission should be looking at, and we will, I think, encourage the staff to come back with a recommendation along those lines. So with that, and we will then take a vote in the matter. Let's see. Is in the matter of item 101, the petition of Keyspan Gas Corporation with petition for authority to defer costs associated with their incremental capital expenditures. All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
No hearing any opposition? No opposition. The recommendation is adopted. Our last item is on the regular agenda is item 102. And this is actually an item that we're just going to have a discussion about. It's regarding the proceeding that we started to revise our New York safety gas regulations to ensure that we have a consistency with the federal gas safety standards. Kevin Speicher, as Chief of Gas Safety, is going to be presenting this with Kim Harriman available for questions. And so, Kevin, just if you can really give us a status update and where we are on this process.
Well, good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. In September, the Commission issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that was intended to align several portions of the New York State gas safety codes with their counterpart federal regulations. These changes dealt with several topics, including the method in which the maximum allowable operating pressure is maintained for pipelines that were built prior to the implementation of gas regulations, odorization of pipelines going into storage, requirements of leakage surveys, and a change in the definition of service line. As part of this rulemaking, staff held stakeholder meetings in New York City and Albany. During these meetings, it became apparent that the change in service line definition was much more complex than originally anticipated. Quickly, New York's definition of service line ends at the building wall, regardless of the meter location. Under the federal rule, a service line ends at the outlet of a meter, regardless of where that meter is located, or at the connection to customer piping if there is no meter. Under the federal definition, 3 similar buildings could have very different jurisdictional service lines based solely on where the meter is located, or even if there is a meter. A change in New York's definition would have a significant impact on New York City, where piping inside a building has been and is required to be installed by licensed master plumbers. Prior to these stakeholder meetings, we anticipated potential adequacy of qualification issues for people working on the portion of gas lines inside buildings that have traditionally been considered customer-owned piping and would be considered service lines under the definition change. This work is sometimes done by plumbers with a quality of work verified by the LDCs through inspection and testing. In New York City, this work was required to be completed by licensed master plumbers. During the stakeholder meetings, it became apparent that these licensed master plumbers had the training and licensing requirements that verified they had the knowledge, skills, and abilities to complete the work in this space, and thus met or even exceeded qualification requirements. This was confirmed during the commenting period after reviewing documentation submitted by various plumber groups that detailed their licensing requirements. At this time, we will proceed on 2 separate paths. For the first path, we plan on returning to the Commission soon at a future session to recommend adoption of the changes that are not controversial, such as dealing with the odorization and cycling of pressure to maintain MAOP. Second, we would like to meet with the U.S. DOT Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to discuss the issues surrounding any changes to the definition of New York service line definition. These meetings will take place over the next few months. At the conclusion of this process, we will report to the Commission. In summary, we believe that as verified through the stakeholder meeting process and comment period, work being completed inside buildings is being done by qualified and experienced people. We will work with our federal counterparts on the definition of service line and come up with needed revisions. At this time, the Commission is not being asked to take any action. And this concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Kevin. First of all, on this matter, we were asked by the Department of Transportation to make sure that our rules and regulations as part of the safety program adhere to the federal rules and guidelines. And this was a matter that really is sort of a long-standing issue given by the complexity of particularly the building stock in New York City. And it was revealed again last year, and we were asked by the Department of Transportation, who effectively helps fund our financing, our safety programs, to make sure that our rules were aligned with theirs. I think that, so the process was begun with that intent in mind. The stakeholder process that ensued afterwards was very informative, because as Kevin mentioned, I think that the plumbers were highly participatory. We recognize that number one is that the qualifications were there, but that secondly, with assumptions we had going in were factually not correct in terms of the way when they work on customer pipes. So I think that was a helpful dialogue and was informative to everybody. The next step for us really then, as Kevin said, is to start looking at the guidelines. One of the things that I was appreciative of in the conversations we had with the Department of Transportation and PHMSA is that they recognize that their definition may be overly rigid in the sense that in application it may not be adhere to what their intent is, and that their intent is really around making sure that utilities are overseeing the safety of pipe at the pressure level of higher pressure, and when it moves to lower typical customer pressure, that they recognize is you don't have the same risk of leaks that are dangerous, and that therefore that management, as has always traditionally been done, really should be part of what the customer looks at. The challenge is coming up with the right definitions, the right way of approaching that, because in both instances, both on the part of the Department of Transportation and this Commission, our utmost concern is safety. And we want to make sure that as we take a look at the roles of the responsibilities of the local distribution company versus the roles of the individual customer, that we're defining this very clearly and the approaches are there. In many respects, I'm aware of the fact that our own rules are necessarily, and I think appropriately, more conservative than some of the federal laws because of the complexity of these issues and the complexity of these buildings. And, you know, in that sense, I think is a good thing. One of the things I will remark is that when we're in discussion with the Department of Transportation about this issue and the need to take a look at how to get both in compliance and substance, but at the language right, one of the things they mentioned, and I don't want to embarrass you, Kevin, but in all sincerity, their willingness to trust us to do the right thing was very much predicated on the aggressiveness of our staff and the capability and competency of our gas safety staff in getting the right work done. And so they were very specifically said, and I would guess, I would surmise that other states may have not gotten such a warm welcome as our state in terms of listening to us and saying their willingness to work with us because they know that our commitment by this agency to gas safety is there, and we talk not just saying it, but we do it based on the professionalism of our staff. So with that, thank you, because I think that's great public service. So with we don't have anything to vote, but I have any further comments on this?
Thank you very much. I also just want to echo the kudos to staff and Kevin in particular. I think what was really very good for us is the collaborative process, not only internally between our gas safety staff, but also working with our counsel's office on the issues, and really then externally reaching out to the relevant stakeholders. I think it's the first time I've seen a notice on a stakeholder conference that really does try to reach out to as many stakeholders by name that it might be affected as possible, and I think that was really very, very helpful. And I know that the stakeholder conferences and the comments really gave us an opportunity to see the challenges in trying to implement something so that we could be in alignment with the federal regs, and also having a recognition that there is a really good opportunity for us to continue the dialogue and improve our systems, not only on this but on other things too. So thank you.
Thank you. So we'll now move to the consent agenda. I note that Commissioner Sayre is recusing himself from item 561. Is any other recusals? Any comments on the consent agenda?
Yes. I just have two quick comments on item 263, which is the matter of the review of existing commission rules and regulations pursuant to SAPA. I just wanted to highlight that in December of 2013, we looked at a similar item where we were looking at our statutory requirements to review certain rules that are enacted on a 5-year cycle and to determine whether they are still relevant. And my comments are similar to what I said in December of 2013, is that I am very much in support of a review and meeting our statutory obligation, but it does go beyond that for me, in that this is just one prong in our extent of our review efforts, and that we really do need to continually look at our regulations and make improvements to them, or streamline them, or get rid of them if they're not necessary. And so I know that staff is looking at that, but really it's not just these items that we should be looking at them, but really on an ongoing basis, continuing to look at our regulations. And I know that folks are focused on that, but I just really wanted to highlight that for me. The other item that I'd like to just highlight is item 563, which is the New Star area code in on Long Island, 631, and there is it is very clear language in our order on the requirements, order clause 1 and 2, in filing plans within 30 days of the date of this order that outlines the implementation for the new code as an overlay, and also requiring plans on outreach and education. And I know the other commissioners share with me that outreach and education is very important, and we'll look forward to reviewing those.
Any other comments on the consent agenda? All those in favor then of the consent agenda, with the notation that Commissioner Sayre is recusing himself from 561, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposition? There being no opposition, the recommendations are adopted. Thank you all very much, and we wish you all a good holiday. Secretary Burgess, is there anything in front of us today? More.
There are no other matters today. The next scheduled commission session is January 8th at 10:30 in Albany.
Thank you.
Is it?